Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I forwarded them off.
Okay, both what we have marked as appellants 42 and appellants 43?
Yes.
All right. And you talked about your understanding about the role of DEP with some things. You understand that DEP regulates a lot of different activities that go on in society, correct?
Correct.
A lot of different land uses. You agree with me?
Yes.
They, for example, regulate quarries.
Yes.
They regulate landfills.
Yes.
The fact that DEP has some regulatory authority over those land uses, that doesn't mean that the township can't exercise its zoning authority over those land uses, correct?
The where, I don't know about where, if the DEP allows to do anything to how operations.
You can decide what zoning districts, operations, what zoning district land uses can go in, even if they're regulated by DEP, correct?
Of those specific ones, yes, that you mentioned.
Now, you mentioned communication that you had earlier with Crystal Yost. Remember that?
She came to visit me, and there were some subsequent emails back and forth.
And among those emails were email communications about the Board of Supervisors' consideration of ordinance 127, correct?
I guess I'd have to look at it.
Can we have that marked as 54, please? This is a July 25th, 2014. That's the top date on this email exchange.
I've not seen a copy.
I'm not going to ask you detailed questions about this, sir. I just want to ask you about.
Can the witness be given a chance to review the document before
Sure.
you ask questions?
I'm just trying to keep things moving.
I understand that.
Let me know when you're ready, sir.
So was I, that you object to put it.
Sounds like Township Elizabeth.
Now, at this time, at July 25th, 2014, has the Planning Commission already met?
I have to look at the calendar, possibly.
You have those minutes.
I have to give them that.
Oh, okay.
For this one. For July 22nd, I think.
July 22nd?
July 22nd, Planning Commission?
Yeah.
Yeah. Got it.
So this was communication you were having with Ms. Yost after the Planning Commission meeting, correct?
Yes.
And the Planning Commission had not made a substantive recommendation.
I got it. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, he's been the longest witness.
I can talk loud.
Go. All right. The Planning Commission had not voted either to approve or to disapprove 127. They voted to say, table it, give more time, correct?
Correct.
And you communicated to Ms. Yost that you were comfortable stating with reasonable certainty that whatever action is accomplished by the board during the August meeting, that was the August 13th meeting, additional hearings would be scheduled as needed to make certain the concerns of the Planning Commission and board are addressed where they can be, correct?
Correct.
In fact, that didn't happen. At the August meeting of the Board of Supervisors, despite the vote of the Planning Commission and despite your reasonable certainty, the board went ahead and adopted 127.
I think for actions accomplished by the board during August, additional hearings will be scheduled as needed to make certain. So I didn't know what they were gonna do at the August meeting.
The reality is that at the August meeting, they adopted ordinance 127, correct?
They proceeded along, correct?
Well, they didn't just proceed along, they ended the ordinance process by voting to adopt it, correct?
They adopted ordinance 127.
All right. You're familiar, I know, from your testimony today with this zoning ordinance, and I take it you were, how long were you zoning officer?
Technically since 1992, but here since 2004.
Okay. And you understand that the zoning office, that part of what the zoning ordinance does is it identifies, we've talked about this, it identifies which uses are allowed in which zoning districts, correct?
Correct.
And the ordinance also says, does it not, and this is at 175-12 on page 34.
What page number?
34.
Yes.
Let me back up. You testified earlier that, that because you didn't see, oh, we're back.
Thank you.
You testified earlier that because we didn't see gas mentioned in the zoning ordinance, that meant that it was allowed everywhere, correct? That was your testimony?
Correct.
But when you look at section 175-12A, the ordinance actually says that any use not expressly listed for a zoning district is not permitted in that district unless authorized by the zoning hearing board as a comparable use not specifically listed in accordance with provisions of 175-105, and it goes on. Correct?
Correct.
And the import, you understand as a zoning official, the import of 175-12A is that if you have a use that's not expressly listed, it means it's not permitted, correct?
That's what this says.
I don't have any other questions.
Freddie, why don't we start where we ended there on 175-12? There's a reference to 175-105.
I know, let's just stop.
Page 88.
I have it.
Starts out, uses of the same general character as any of the uses authorized as permitted uses by right or uses by special exception shall be allowed, then it goes on to talk about the zoning hearing board, correct?
Correct.
Did you view unconventional horizontal drilling as being of the same general character as any use listed in the zoning ordinance anywhere?
No.
Did you think this provision was applicable?
No.
And you were asking questions about the time frame. An email from Rex Council to your memo to the board. And there was a 3-day time frame between June 10th and June 13th.
Yes.
Recall if you began work on the draft prior to June 10th?
We had a draft floating around in our server probably when the intern started. And I would putz with it every now and then until Act 13 was in place. And then once Act 13 was repealed, I made it active again and started looking at it, tweaking it.
Okay, would the board of supervisors had a work session prior to June 10th
Yes.
that month?
Yes.
Do you recall when the board, you had discussions with the board about moving forward?
I did, and I expressed to the board my concerns about this continuing on and on and on. And I said, from an administrative standpoint, I said, we need to do something, and they authorized me to begin drafting the ordinance. Them not knowing, because the board turned over to our head an ordinance in place, at least a template in place, I was still cutting and pasting it, trying to get it to work.
And it was called Nottingham.
And you've been thinking about the need for ordinance for quite some time. I think that's probably correct.
I submitted an application with Government County for an intern to help draft the ordinance prior to Act 13 being enacted.
Prior to actually,
Prior to Act 13 being enacted, yes.
in 2012, prior to.
Prior to this, I forget what summer it was, but I think it was the summer of 2012 is when we had the intern here for Open Government County.
And you were asking questions about public utilities and public utility buildings.
Yes.
And it's fair to say that the public utilities, except buildings, are permitted use in all of the zoning districts.
Yes,
And then the public utilities themselves, and the public utility buildings follow as a conditional use.
that is correct.
And you were asked a question about applicant 53, which would have been the letter you sent in support of the Act 13 challenge. Right?
Yes.
And wasn't the concern that you had was that it took away all of your ability to do any sort of zoning with respect to where activities occur?
Correct.
Okay, and Mr. Yeager used the term that zoning involves the balancing of judgments and decisions. And with respect to locations or restrictions on locations, Act 13 tied your hands and said as a township you couldn't make those types of balancing of judgments. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And you and the board were in support of local judgments in terms of local judgments being made for zoning, correct?
Correct.
The difference in ordinance 127 between well site development and compressor stations and natural gas processing plants is different in one respect in terms of the requirement for a building permit.
That's correct.
And one would be considered land development and one would not, is that correct?
That's correct. We were given, meaning municipalities were given memos, and it wasn't just in Butler County, it was other counties that the counties were trying to get gas well sites submitted as land development so the county could review them. There were strong opposition letters approved, but some court doctrine that says, no, these are not land developments. So therefore, you cannot regulate through land development or saldo ordinance gas well sites. But because we have structures with compressor stations and processing plants, structures, therefore it's land development, therefore the saldo subdivision land development ordinances were applicable.
And actual construction permits and codes as well.
And you would further along with construction code, plan reviews, and then inspections along the way.
I don't have any other questions.
Mr. Fodi, I can see the finish line here. You have applicant 29 or 39 there in front of you, that letter from Jennifer McDonough. Got an email on top of it. As I understand it, on June 10, you get a letter from Rex Energy, Jennifer McDonough, and on June 10, 2014, I'm correct that 127 wasn't passed yet, correct?
That's correct.
And as you told me before 127 existed, the township didn't restrict where I could put my oil and gas well, did it?
We did
I
not.
could put it anywhere. So on June 10, with no regulation in place, Jennifer McDonough from Rex Energy is writing to you and saying, please give me clarity. Please pass an ordinance, is she not?
She is.
And she's giving you a copy of an ordinance that somebody else had passed, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So even though this activity was unregulated, she's asking to be regulated, is she not?
Correct.
You were asked a bunch of questions about PRDs and all the things that the township ordinance does for PRDs that it does not do in 127.
Are you aware of any state preemption, any state law that preempts the township's ability to regulate PRDs?
No,
Is that the same with respect to oil and gas operations?
no, it's not.
Could you explain that?
I'll try. The MPC gives specific provisions about planned residential developments, from density calculations to improvements to open space to other characteristics that's not unique to a simple subdivision or even a major subdivision. It's been so long since I did my first PRDs. In essence, the PRD is a unique character and design development that's not your typical standard development. You would see 1 acre lots, no sidewalks, no other amenities. So the MPC created this section that allowed flexibility of each community respective, and even PRDs within the same community are different based on zoning designations, based on locations, based on the amenities that are provided. It further goes along and then it created the town center, which is even higher density development. So the MPC allowed the municipality to focus its characteristics of the types of developments it wanted to have in its township, because they're permanent in nature and it's expansion and it does control sprawl. What the townships didn't want to do is relinquish that right, because conversely, DEP probably doesn't want to have 2,500 energy policies referring to 2,500 municipalities in the Commonwealth. It's an action, it's a provision, it's something that's not across the Commonwealth, at least in the Marshall to Shell area. The DEP wanted to have standardized language and standardized provisions about the how the operations, but they gave the right to where they would be in the township up to the municipality, at least gave it back to the sending parts of Act 13.
So all those things Mr. Yeager asked you about with respect to PRDs, and he said, well, this exists with respect to PRDs, but does it with respect to 127. There's a reason it doesn't exist with respect to 127. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Because it's preempted by state law.
It's preempted by state law, and it's my conjecture that if we did do that, Mr. Yeager would be sitting there, and Rex Senator would be sitting there.
Final question. Mr. Yeager asked you about your visit to the Reno well pad and the muster site. The muster site was where you go if there's an emergency, correct?
Yes.
You've been in schools, elementary schools?
Yes.
There's a bell that rings when there's a fire? And what happens? People go where?
Well, they follow the paths, they also have area of rescue.
And they go to a muster station?
Go to a muster station, yes.
So even though they might not do that at a farm, as Mr. Yeager points out, they have a place where you muster if you're in a school and in an emergency.
We also do it on cruise ships when we do our annual vacation.
Cruise ships, anything like that. So, okay. No further questions. Thanks. Just on this last area first, you can't point to any section of state law, whether it's Act 13 or the Oil and Gas Act prior to Act 13, that prevents a township from requiring an applicant to submit information about existing and proposed topography, do you?
I'm sorry, I say that question. I'm sorry.
You're not aware of any section of the State Oil and Gas Act that prohibits, that preempts a township's ability to require of an applicant for a gas well or these other related uses information about existing topography, correct?
No.
And you're not aware of anything in the Oil and Gas Act that prevents, that preempts a municipality's ability as part of a zoning ordinance to require information about the design of all screening buffer yards and landscaping, correct?
Correct.
And you're not aware of anything in state law that preempts a township's ability to require information on the feasibility of proposals for water supply and the disposition of stormwater and waste, correct?
Correct.
You're not aware of anything in state law that preempts the township's ability to require an applicant to prove that what's being proposed for an oil and gas well site, for an impoundment pit, for pipelines, for compressor stations, for natural gas processing facilities is consistent with the comprehensive plan, correct?
Correct.
So in fact, all the things that we listed of requiring an applicant, you can't point to anything in any state law that preempts the township's ability to do that, can you?
I cannot.
Now, and this notion that these things are specific to PRDs, the township, you require the same kinds of things if you want to erect a billboard in the township, don't you?